In a few seconds, a bomb will detonate here. Everyone on board will die. It is 7:02 in the evening on December 21st, 1988. Pan American Flight 103 is cruising at 31,000 feet above the Scottish countryside. The cabin is warm. The seatbelt signs are off. A 13-year-old girl named Stephanie Martin is somewhere in the back of the plane, flying home to New Jersey for Christmas with her family. A group of 35 Syracuse University students are scattered across the cabin, returning from a semester abroad in London. Captain James McQuarrie has flown this route dozens of times. He is 45 minutes from the Scottish coast and has no reason to think about anything except the Atlantic crossing ahead. He will never reach it. At exactly 7:03 in the evening, a timer hits 0 inside a brown Samsonite suitcase in the forward cargo hold. The device, 450 grams of Semtex plastic explosive, packed inside a Toshiba radio cassette player, hidden beneath a layer of clothing, detonates. The blast tears a 20-inch hole in the fuselage. A pressure wave travels through the aircraft's structure faster than the human brain can register. The nose section separates from the body of the plane in under 3 seconds. The wings, still carrying 200,000 pounds of jet fuel, break away and fall toward the town of Lockerbie below. When they hit Sherwood Crescent, the fireball is visible from 15 miles away. 11 residents of Lockerbie died on the ground. All 259 people aboard the aircraft died in the air. Total dead, 270. No distress call was ever transmitted. The radar return for Clipper Maid of the Seas simply disappeared. A blip that was there and then was not. And in the silence that followed, one of the most complex criminal investigations in history was about to begin. It would last 13 years, span 4 continents, produce 1 conviction, and leave a wound that is never fully closed. This is the story of how 270 people were killed by a bomb no one was supposed to find, and what happened when investigators started finding it anyway. We are going to follow the evidence from a Scottish field to a Libyan intelligence operation. We are going to trace the diplomatic machinery that kept the suspects protected for a decade. We are going to examine how a trial conducted in a neutral country became one of the most unusual legal proceedings of the 20th century. And we are going to sit with what the investigation ultimately produced: 1 conviction, 1 acquittal, and a level of certainty that, depending on who you ask, is either justice or a very expensive approximation of it. In the days after the crash, 1,100 police officers walked the hills and fields around Lockerbie in lines, shoulder to shoulder, slow, methodical, eyes on the ground. They were looking for everything: luggage, clothing, documents, human remains. The wreckage field stretched 60 miles in one direction. The nose section of the aircraft landed intact, 7 miles from the main impact site, cockpit windows still in their frames. The tail section came down in a farmer's field. Entire rows of passenger seats, still buckled together, were found embedded in a hillside. The Scottish investigators were joined almost immediately by the FBI, the CIA, British intelligence, and aviation accident investigators from both countries. What made this scene different from a conventional crash was the question that no one had yet officially asked, but everyone was already working toward: was this deliberate? The answer came quickly, too quickly for some. Within the wreckage, forensic teams began finding blast residue, the chemical signature of an explosion. They found structural damage patterns inconsistent with mechanical failure, and they found, eventually, a fragment. A fragment of green circuit board, no larger than a thumbnail, embedded in a piece of charred clothing recovered from a field in Dumfries and Galloway. It would take months to understand what it was, years to understand where it came from, and the full weight of what that fragment implied would not become clear until 1991, 3 years after the crash. But in the winter of 1988, standing in a Scottish field, holding a piece of plastic smaller than a postage stamp, the investigators already knew one thing. Someone had built this bomb very carefully. What happened to the aircraft in the seconds after detonation was reconstructed, piece by piece, over months of forensic analysis. The blast created a pressure bubble inside the cargo container. That bubble expanded outward, punching through the container wall and the fuselage skin simultaneously. A second shock wave, reflected back from the hole's edge, then pushed the metal outward in a star-shaped pattern. The pressure moved upward through the structure, fracturing floor beams, severing cables, compromising the load-bearing spine of the aircraft. 2 seconds after detonation, the nose section began separating. 3 seconds after detonation, it was gone, tumbling backward, striking one of the engines as it fell, and sending the rest of the aircraft into an uncontrolled roll. The tail section separated, the wings broke apart. The fuselage, now in multiple pieces, began its fall from 31,000 feet. It took the debris approximately 3 minutes to reach the ground. The nose section, with the bodies of the flight crew still strapped into their seats, landed in a field 4 miles east of Lockerbie. The cockpit windows were still in their frames. The first theory was wrong. In the months after Lockerbie, the investigation pointed, with considerable confidence, at a Palestinian splinter group called the PFLP-GEC, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command. Led by a former Syrian army officer named Ahmed Jibril, the group had been caught 2 months before the bombing in West Germany in possession of Semtex-laden bombs concealed in Toshiba radio cassette players. It was exactly the same device profile as the Lockerbie bomb. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The timing was right. The method was right. The motive was coherent. Intelligence reports said the PFLP-GC had been contracted by Iran to retaliate for the U.S. Navy's accidental shoot-down of Iran Air Flight 655 in July 1988, which killed 290 Iranian civilians. The U.S. and British governments were moving in this direction. Quietly, diplomatically, the pressure was building toward an accusation. And then the Gulf War happened. In August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The United States needed to build a coalition, fast, broad, and politically durable. Syria, whose government maintained direct ties to Ahmed Jibril and the PFLP-GC, was a crucial component of that coalition. President Hafez al-Assad's participation gave the operation Arab legitimacy it could not get from Gulf states alone. Iran's tacit non-interference was equally valuable. A hostile Iran on the eastern flank would have complicated everything. Accusing Syria's closest Palestinian allies of mass murder was not compatible with that coalition. Accusing Iran, whose cooperation the United States quietly needed, was even less compatible. No official ever said the investigation was redirected. No memo was declassified, ordering investigators to look elsewhere. What happened was subtler, and, in many ways, more troubling. The PFLPGC theory simply stopped generating momentum. Leads were followed less aggressively. Resources shifted. The political atmosphere around the investigation changed, and in intelligence work, atmosphere is everything. What gets funded, what gets prioritized, what gets quietly left in a drawer, all of it responds to the temperature in the room. The PFLPGC theory didn't disappear. It was more precisely set aside. The investigation continued, but its political context had changed entirely. And when the evidence eventually pointed somewhere different, toward Libya, toward Gaddafi, toward a country with far less geopolitical value to Washington in 1991 than Syria or Iran, the question that no one wanted to ask out loud was whether that change of direction was driven by forensics or by convenience. The thumbnail-sized piece of circuit board had a designation, PT-35B. By 1991, forensic scientists at the Royal Armaments Research and Development Establishment in England had traced it to a specific type of timer, an MST-13, manufactured by a Swiss company called Mebo. Mebo had sold a batch of these timers to exactly one customer, Libya, specifically to the Libyan intelligence service, the Jamahiriya Security Organization. The circuit board fragment had been found inside the collar of a shirt. The shirt was traced through a label to a clothing shop in Malta. A Maltese shopkeeper named Tony Gaushi remembered selling a bundle of clothes, the same clothes found in the wreckage, to a Libyan man on a date he struggled to pin down precisely, but which was consistent with either November or December 1988. The bomb, investigators now concluded, had been loaded onto a feeder flight from Malta to Frankfurt, transferred at Frankfurt onto a London-bound flight, and then loaded again at Heathrow onto Pan Am 103. It had passed through 3 airports undetected, and it had been built, transported, and deployed by 2 men, Abdelbasset al-Megrahi, a Libyan intelligence officer, and Lamin Khalifa Fima, the Libyan Arab Airlines station manager in Malta. In November 1991, the United States and United Kingdom simultaneously indicted both men. Libya's leader, Muammar Gaddafi, refused to hand them over. The standoff that followed would last 8 more years. Gaddafi's position was not merely defiant, it was theatrical. He argued that the indictments were politically motivated, that Libya had been targeted because it was convenient, not because it was guilty. He offered counter-proposals. The men could be tried in Libya, or by Arab nations, or by a neutral international body. Each offer was rejected. Each rejection produced another offer. The cycle repeated itself for years. The United Nations imposed sanctions on Libya in 1992. Libyan aircraft were banned from international airspace. Arms embargoes were applied. The Libyan economy, heavily dependent on oil revenues and international trade, began to strain. But Gaddafi did not surrender his men. What he understood, and what the families of the 270 victims understood with increasing bitterness, was that the international community's leverage was limited. Military force was not seriously considered. Economic pressure was real but survivable. And time, in these negotiations, worked differently for different parties. For the families, particularly the American families organized under a group called Victims of Pan Am Flight 103, every year of delay was a year of watching the men they believed responsible walk free in Tripoli. Some of them had been fighting since 1989. By the late 1990s, they had been fighting for a decade. One of those people was Dr. Jim Swire, a British physician from Worcestershire. His daughter Flora was 23 years old when she boarded Pan Am Flight 103 at Heathrow. She had just graduated from university and was flying to visit her boyfriend in New York for Christmas. Jim Swire became, in the years that followed, the most prominent and most complicated figure in the Lockerbie family's campaign. Complicated because he did not simply want justice, he wanted truth. And he became increasingly convinced, the more he studied the case, the more he sat through the trial, the more he read the evidence, that those two things were not the same. He would spend the next 3 decades pursuing the distinction. The British and American governments tried different approaches: quiet diplomacy, public pressure, back-channel negotiations through intermediaries in Saudi Arabia and South Africa. Nelson Mandela personally intervened, arguing that the case deserved a neutral venue, that no nation should be judge, jury, and executioner in a case that concerned its own citizens. It was Mandela's argument that eventually moved things. In 1998, after years of negotiation, the United States and the United Kingdom proposed a compromise. The trial would be held in the Netherlands, under Scottish law, before a panel of Scottish judges, with no jury. Libya's 2 suspects would be handed over to this neutral court. Gaddafi agreed. On April 5, 1999, Abdel Basset al-Megrahi and Lamin Fima boarded a United Nations chartered aircraft in Tripoli. After 10 years, 4 months, and 15 days, the investigation was about to become a trial. The court convened at a former U.S. Air Force base in the Dutch countryside called Camp Zeist. It was unlike any criminal proceeding in history. Scottish law, Dutch soil, 3 judges, no jury, 2 defendants accused of the most lethal act of aviation terrorism ever committed against a Western carrier. The prosecution presented 230 witnesses over the course of a trial that would last 9 months. The case rested on several key pillars: the fragment of MST-13 timer traced to Libya, the clothing purchased in Malta, identified through Tony Gauchi's testimony, Megrahi's documented presence in Malta in December 1988, his intelligence background, and his access to the timers. Each pillar, presented in isolation, was suggestive. Together, the prosecution argued, they formed a chain of evidence that could only lead to one conclusion. The defense challenged every link. The timer fragment, PT-35B, had passed through so many hands before it was formally logged into the evidence chain that questions of contamination or mishandling were not unreasonable. Tony Gauchi, the Maltese shopkeeper whose identification of Megrahi was central to the case, had been shown photographs of Megrahi after seeing his image in a news magazine that named him as a suspect. The precise date of the Malta clothes purchase remained disputed. Gauchi had received, it later emerged, $2 million from the U.S. Department of Justice in a witness protection arrangement. On January 31, 2001, the 3 judges delivered their verdict. Lamin Fima, not guilty. Abdel Basset al-Megrahi, guilty. Sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 20 years. The courtroom was quiet for a long moment after it was read. The families wept, some from relief and some from a grief that the verdict did not resolve. Because the verdict answered the WHO of Lockerbie, it did not answer, at least not fully, how high it went. Megrahi was an intelligence officer. He did not act alone. That was not a controversial claim. It was a logical one, accepted by the prosecution and implicit in the verdict. An MST-13 timer, does not travel from a Libyan intelligence facility to a Maltese clothing shop to the cargo hold of a Boeing 747 without an infrastructure behind it. Behind Megrahi, there were orders. Behind the orders, there was a chain of command that ran, investigators believed, toward Gaddafi's inner circle, and possibly to Gaddafi himself. None of that was prosecuted at Camp Zeist. It could not be. The evidence, as it existed, was sufficient to convict Megrahi. It was not sufficient, or not politically available, to go further. Megrahi began serving his sentence at Greenock Prison in Scotland. He maintained his innocence. His legal team filed an appeal. The Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission, after a lengthy review, found in 2007 that his conviction may have been a miscarriage of justice, citing specifically the questions around Tony Gauchi's identification and the circumstances of his $2 million payment. The appeal was in progress when Megrahi was diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer. In August 2009, the Scottish government released him on compassionate grounds. He was given 3 months to live. He returned to Tripoli to a welcome that outraged the victims' families, who watched footage of crowds cheering a man they considered a mass murderer. The Scottish and US governments insisted that the release had been a purely humanitarian decision, and they insisted with somewhat less conviction when documents later suggested that commercial oil interests between Libya and Britain had formed part of the background to that decision. Megrahi died in May 2012. He had outlived his diagnosis by nearly 3 years. His appeal died with him. The questions it might have answered died with it. And the families, who had been fighting since 1988, who had waited a decade for a trial, who had watched the convicted man walk free after 8 years, who had been told by the Scottish Review Commission that justice may have been incomplete, were left with a verdict, a death, and no further process. Jim Swire was among them. He had attended the trial at Camp Zeist every day. He had read every document. He had met in a moment that shocked many of the other families, with Megrahi himself in Greenock Prison, sitting across a table from the man convicted of killing his daughter, looking him in the eye, trying to understand. He came away not with certainty of Megrahi's guilt, but with something more unsettling, genuine doubt. He continued to campaign after Megrahi's death. He gave interviews. He wrote. He appeared before parliamentary committees. He was dismissed by some of the American victim families as a man who had lost his way in grief, who had been manipulated by a convicted terrorist's legal team, who was causing pain to families who needed closure more than they needed re-examination. He did not stop. In 2024, an Academy Award-winning actor portrayed him in a television series about the case. His face, older now, the face of a man who had spent nearly 4 decades carrying the same question, appeared on screens around the world. A new generation encountered Lockerbie for the first time. And a new generation asked the same question he had been asking since 1989. Did they get the right man? In 2020, the United States indicted a third Libyan man, Abu Agela Massoud, a bomb maker alleged to have constructed the device used at Lockerbie. He was arrested in 2022 after the post-Gaddafi Libyan government handed him over, 34 years after the crash. The investigation, it turned out, was not finished. But the families, most of them now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, have been living with a particular kind of incompleteness for 3.5 decades. The kind that comes not from absence of information, but from its abundance. Too many contested facts, too many witnesses, whose credibility was challenged, too many political calculations that shaped what got prosecuted and what got quietly set aside. What Lockerbie exposed and what its investigation, across 13 years and beyond, made impossible to ignore is the gap that exists between the mechanics of justice and its meaning. Courts find facts, they weigh evidence, they deliver verdicts, but they cannot compel the full truth when the full truth requires powerful governments to acknowledge their own compromises. The bomb that destroyed Pan Am 103 was built by people who believed it would never be traced. They were almost right. And in the distance between almost and entirely, in that gap, 270 people remain unreachable. Their families remain unfinished. And the case remains, even now, a verdict in search of a complete answer.